I've got some show and tell. Let's see. I was going to do a brief little bit on the biblical criticisms. Last time talked about the lower criticism was just the textual criticism to try to figure out with the manuscripts that were found, were these true and authentic ancient manuscripts, and then how accurate were they as they compare them to others, and try to get the best manuscript and the best ones to try to use then to interpret either the Greek or the Hebrew Aramaic words in order to bring it to our English translation. So that's a special science, big study in itself. Then higher criticism moves into the next one would be historical criticism, and that is just to try to authenticate whether the story that's being told has any basis in history, or is it only a parable, a story, like a historical novel. It's set in a time and place, but actually that event never really happened. It's a lesson story instead of a historical remembrance. So the historical accuracy in historical criticism tries to answer the question, did that event really happen? Did this person it's talking about actually live? And is there such a place actually that can be found as a historical site? And as they and the way they do that is, of course, archaeology. If you can find a historical site that's described to be in a certain place, and then you dig and dig and you found a city has been there by the foundations and wells and whatnot. The persons are often difficult, but I think I mentioned before that in our world today, when so much is electronic or paper records, and if you have a fire or an explosion, it's gone. But in a great library in the ancient world, when they used the cuneiform form of writing on clay tablets, they had a fire and it baked them and preserved them. And then when they dug them up, hey, they were still existed. And from those kind of records, if you find similar names as we find in the Bible, then there's a link that it might be that Bible character. So it kind of authenticates that particularly in these Genesis and early studies, that these might be actually verified by what we call extra biblical material, outside the Bible material. So that's another way of the historical verification that something actually happened. But in historical criticism, sometimes an event is mentioned as happening at a certain time, but as we compare other things, we find that, well, it didn't happen then. For example, a lot of things are in the reign of King so-and-so that this happened. Well, they're able to check other things, and they find that the reign of that king was a certain date. But yet, the event, they find historical evidence, was 500 years earlier or 500 years later. So something doesn't jive historically. So we see in the historical criticism that it isn't exactly that way. Sort of the Aye Asher Aye that Muzan's always talking about, I am who I am, that Moses heard at the burning bush. Okay, that was the first revelation of that name. But yet when we have events described as happening earlier than Moses, but yet they use that name, then it's anachronistic. It's out of chronology. And so we know that when that story was being told and written had to have been after the Moses event. It couldn't predate Moses because they wouldn't be using that name. So the ancient folks weren't so critical about historical accuracy like we are, because, as I've said before, their main concern is more with what does the story mean? What is the lesson there? They aren't going to take a test in like history today where you have to get the exact dates correct. Another form of biblical criticism was called patternism, and that comes from comparative religions and looking at some of the patterns of the stories and the way things were structured. But also we see that sometimes pottery and tools, the patterns that we see in the culture and the way people live in the other cultures and with the other religions, have some similarity. So what we find there is there's some cross-fertilization of those cultures, and sometimes the ideas and the influences, sometimes the stories, we see some influences by seeing similar patterns. We used to think the Hebrew people were, isolated and different from everybody else, but they weren't. They were a Semitic people, and they had influences and intermingling, and as Muzan would often say, they intermarried. And so you know how much in today, when you got people from very strong religious backgrounds and the young couple get married, it's kind of hard to blend those, so they'll end up being one or the other, or have to pick something neutral in between. And so in that blending, their faith changes. It's not exactly like it was in one household or the other. There becomes a kind of blending. And sometimes the blending is richer for it, but sometimes lots of things are lost. So we see some of those things happening as we read the stories. Another biblical criticism they talk about is form criticism. In any text we read, what kind of literature is it? We have in the New Testament Paul's letters, and then in a lot of the Old Testament we have what are the Chronicles of the King. We know this literature came from whatever records were being kept at the court, and then some of the language is what's being recorded here. Is it formal language, like in the court of the king when everybody's all dressed up and trying to impress people, or is it common street language? Is it a joke? Is it a pun? Is it an idiomatic phrase? Is it scholarly or is it crude? And so we have to look at those kinds of styles that happen. And then a lot of things that in movies, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy finds girl again, or girl meets boy, girl loses boy. Anyway, we've got the love story happening of where, everything's going to be wonderful, something happens, they have a fight or a misunderstanding, they get lost, they get back together, and that's how the story works. Well, in biblical stories, so often the storyline is conflict narrative. There's some kind of conflict going on. We have Joseph and his brothers, the sibling rivalry. Jacob and Esau, the sibling rivalry, conflict is what kind of motivates the story and keeps it going. But, and this is kind of the last thing I'll end with on the biblical criticism and the styles of that, we assume that whatever, all the materials that were available, some got the status as sacred and became the canon. And we know there are a lot of them that didn't make it. They weren't there. And it's kind of like the classic literature that we have. If it speaks to people generation after generation, people keep reading it because it speaks to them. It tells them something. Well, the same is how things got to be our sacred text, but not just telling them something, but basically was answering a question. The texts were there to answer questions that the people had. And the most important one was, who is God? But besides that, then the next is, what is God like? What kind of a God is this in comparison to all the other people's gods? How is our God different? And then the next question is, who are we? And then a part of that, why did God choose us? God could have chosen any other people. Why did God choose us? And then because God created us and chose us, God must have had a purpose. What was God's purpose in choosing us? And then as we kind of figure that out, then we come up with, if God made us for a purpose, then God wants us to do things a certain way. How shall we live? So it's answering the questions, how shall we live? And a part of that is, how shall we worship God? How shall we live with one another? So the biblical analysis and criticisms look at, well, what is the question troubling the people at this particular time that this text was written? What was going on there? So what was the question they were asking that this text became the answer? Now, sometimes that's preserved with a historical setting, and then sometimes it's a universal question and a universal answer that speaks for generation after generation to God's people. Now, we've got to begin with Genesis 1:1. What Bible did Muzan recommend? Okay, New Revised Standard. One of the, what might have been his reasons for that? Yes. And the other probably most important reason, if you didn't bring a Bible, that's the one that's in your pew back. And we'll all be on the same page and have the same verses. But the Bible there is not a study Bible. It's a little bit thinner. Study Bibles get big and fat like this, and they have lots of nice footnotes. If you take Disciple Bible Study, usually they recommend the New Oxford Annotated Bible with the Apocrypha, and it's in the New Revised Standard Version. But there are other good study Bibles. But it's best to use one from a scholarly tradition. But this is the one we will usually use. This one is that we use mostly in our Disciple Bible is the Oxford annotated version as a study Bible. And it is in the Revised Standard Version. So we will begin Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth," that's verse 1. And then verse 2, "The earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters." Now, there are lots of different ways of reading that, and that's why I brought the other bag of books, because other Bibles, other translations say it differently. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Now, some of them make it plural, heavens. Now, the earth was a formless void, and there was darkness over the deep, with a divine wind sweeping over the waters. Now, this says, while a wind from God, and this says a divine wind was sweeping over the waters. And that was the New Jerusalem Bible. And let's see, this one is the New English Bible. It says, "In the beginning of creation," which is adding, didn't say in the beginning when God created, it says in the beginning of creation, "When God made heaven and earth, the earth was without form and void, with darkness over the face of the abyss," rather than the deep, "and a mighty wind that swept over the surface of the waters." So that one's got a little different twist to it. And let's see, and this one was the King James Version, and it's a study Bible with concordance that in college, I was advised not to take religion courses in undergraduate level because they said they would be too superficial and they wouldn't give you all the depth that you need. So wait until you get to seminary before you take religion courses. But at the University of Kansas, one of the most exciting professors in the English department, I got my degree, a double major, English and philosophy, was the literary aspects of the King James Bible. And so our textbook was a King James version of the Bible, but a study Bible, so that we could not only learn the literary aspects, but some of the others. And can you believe it? In college, I had to read almost the whole Bible. In college. How many college students do that? Which reminded me of Elizabeth Galloway. You all remember Elizabeth Galloway. Paul and Elizabeth had a son, Paul Jr. And at her funeral, Paul Jr. spoke. And he said a couple of things about Elizabeth. And one of them was very complimentary to me. He reviewed this in his message. He said, Elizabeth said she didn't believe in funerals. Just kind of throw me in the ground and forget about it. She just didn't believe in funerals. And Muzan had told her, Elizabeth, when you die, your son owns your body, and he and I will decide what we're going to do. But in the meantime, she had heard my introduction to one of the funeral services I was doing for somebody else, and she had come. And a part of that, I try to give a theological basis about life and death and why we're here. And one of the things that I had said, she said, "Oh, well, that makes sense." And I changed her mind, which is a minor miracle, as strong-willed as Elizabeth was. But when she sent Paul Jr. off to college, she got his Bible, and they told him to read your Bible. And when he'd come home from vacation and bring his Bible, she would ask, "Paul Jr., have you been reading your Bible?" "Yes, Mother, yes, Mother." And then she said, "Would you bring your Bible to me?" And she said, "Okay." So he brought the Bible to her, and she started thumbing through and pulled out a $10 bill and thumbed through and pulled out another $10 bill and thumbed through and pulled out another $10 bill. And she emptied the Bible of the $10 bills that she had put there to encourage him to read and to test him. Well, anyway, what reminded me of that story was that I was getting ready for this, and I opened up one of the Bibles that I used to use a lot, and there was two $20 bills just right there at 1 Kings 14. Now, I don't know when or why I stuck them there, but thank you, Jesus. I was blessed. And anyway, the point of that is you don't know what kind of surprises you might find in this book when you start reading. But anyway, in this one, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and the darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Now, did anybody here, now this is really different. What moved on the waters here? Spirit of God. What was moving on the waters in these other versions? Wind. Well, wind from God was one, and a divine wind in another one. Two more different ones. This is the little Good News Bible that I used for a while, and gosh, when I was down in Ada, this one really threw me one Sunday, because we think that all these Bibles are alike, but one Sunday, and I can't remember what it was right now, but this one I had studied and I'd looked up, and I forgot to mark the Bible because I used different ones, but I was reading this in church because it was a little easier version, more understandable, and so forth. Anyway, when I got to the text for that Sunday and looked, it wasn't in here. This particular translation didn't put those verses. It's one of the minor glitches between Bible translations that sometimes they accept them. When we study the New Testament, y'all have been to Mark and dealt with the ending of Mark. And most scholars understand that Mark 14:8 was where Mark ended. But other people came along and they thought, well, that's too abrupt. The two women that found the tomb empty, the angel or the person there in the white glowing robes said, "Go tell the disciples." But they didn't. They ran away afraid, and they told nobody. End of the gospel. Well, how can we have a church if they didn't go tell anybody? Well, anyway, other people came along and thought, well, it must have gotten broken off because that was the end of that scroll, or, somebody killed him or something before he finished or something. So they added, there's a shorter ending and a longer ending. So if the text for one Sunday was the longer ending, and you go to a Bible that doesn't put it in there, because some of them don't, they'll put it in a footnote, but it's not in the text of the Bible. So anyway, that was a surprise. But this one is different. In the beginning, when God created the universe, not the heavens and the earth, but the universe. And the earth was formless and desolate. The raging ocean that covered everything was engulfed in total darkness, and the power of God was moving over the water. So we have these different ways of expressing, and see, there's one more. Through the years, I've gotten different Bibles. This one is the Amplified Version, where it's not an actual translation as such. It's sort of like, what's the Bible? The one that's the paraphrase version. It's got a Living Bible. This paraphrase. It's not a true translation. They look at the translations and then they try to paraphrase it into more common, understandable language. The Amplified does a similar thing. It was before the Living Bible. So it goes, in the beginning God, and this one's really interesting, parenthesis, in the beginning God prepared, comma, formed, comma, fashioned, comma, parentheses closed, and created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and an empty waste, and darkness was upon the face of the very great deep. The Spirit of God was moving, comma, parenthesis, hovering, comma, brooding, parenthesis closed, over the face of the waters. That's the first 2 verses of the Bible. All these different ways of trying to express that are all very interesting. Now there in this one, it had in the footnotes, and like I say, the study Bibles get real fat because the first half of the page, well, the first third of the page is the intro, Genesis, the origin of the world and of the human race, the creation and the fall, and then creation of the world, and then after a third, we have the next third is text, and then the bottom third, all scrunched up in little tiny print, is all these notes. And it's kind of that way. Oh my goodness, over here on the next page, the top fourth is text, and the bottom 3/4 is notes. So study Bibles are not, now that's something that, just an aside here, why do we read the Bible? Why do you read the Bible? Or do you? I mean, some people don't. They have these big, beautiful Bibles that are coffee table Bibles, and the purpose for the Bible is to collect dust, and so, or to write, family history in the front, and, that's its only purpose. It's so big you can't lose it, so you always know where that family history is. But why do we read the Bible? So we can, answering those questions, understand God. Other reasons, find comfort. Okay. Guidance for daily living. Peace of mind. That's related to comfort. Increase our knowledge. Just knowledge about the Bible. So we know more about the Bible, or knowledge of God, or... Yeah. Excuse me? Oh, okay. Well, thanks for coming. We have different reasons, but one of the big ones that nobody's mentioned exactly yet, but comfort is one, is devotional reading. To try to get connected to God, to feel God's love, comfort, presence as we read these stories. It helps us. And so devotional reading is quite a bit different than scholarly reading. Trying to get information, to learn more about this book. Some of it is, we might want to know, just the stories about the children of Israel. The first families in the Bible, Abraham and Sarah, and Jacob and Isaac, and Joseph and his brothers, and some of the history. Those things are interesting if you're a history person. But then there's the devotional part of trying to, what we call spiritual formation, to help God work on us to shape and mold our spirit, our character, our morality, our sense of what we're called to do, to find motivation, inspiration, to be a better person, to do more, to be more like Jesus, to be more like what we think God wants us to be. Now, we can read this and find out what we're supposed to do, but there's lots of people know what to do, but there aren't so many people who actually do what they're supposed to do. And so we can read this for the motivation, the inspiration, and that's devotional reading. But academic or scholarly or study reading has our mind in a little different place, and we're wanting to get the knowledge. But from that can turn into devotional, because as we learn something, we get some ahas. Oh my gosh, and sometimes it'll touch our heart or our soul. But when we got started, that wasn't what we're looking for. So in our study, we will try to do both. But anyway, in this part, the narrative is ascribed to the priestly source. So the priests are really beginning this story, and they're carrying it out. But anyway, in the second note, it says, when God began creating heaven and earth, the earth being a formless void with darkness over the deep, and a divine wind sweeping over the waters. And then it goes with God said. So, what are we to make of all of that? I've got some notes. One, before we go any farther, Muzan was really good about talking about creatio ex nihilo. Anybody remember what that was? Creation out of nothingness. That there was totally nothing, and then God creates, and then there is something. And that expression comes from the strong Greek influence on the church as the church was trying to work out its doctrines and beliefs, where we got our Nicene Creed and so forth. But Genesis 1 and 2 create a problem for that proposition, because it really isn't saying that there was nothing there, because when God began creating the heavens and the earth, when he began, the earth was already there as a formless void. The deep, the waters were already there when God began to create, as far as the vision of these folks. That doesn't mean it's right or wrong. Just because they were writing it doesn't mean that they had the proper scientific vision, but they weren't having the same agenda as the early church was trying to do as they were wrestling out the church doctrine. And a big part of it was they got really distracted in their hair splitting, because they were asking questions that, if we have one God, and the one God concept is so vital to our faith, how do we reconcile that with Jesus is the Son of God? Because the pagan religions around us, Caesar decided he was Son of God. Pharaoh decided he was Son of God. And we don't believe that stuff. So how can we reconcile this? And so they really struggled with that. And so they were in those really highly rational, analytical mindset. And so a part of that came up with the creatio ex nihilo. But these stories need to be set in contrast with the belief systems at the time, and what those writers were trying to say, not so much in itself, but over and against the others. And we have the Amuna Elish creation stories of the Babylonian part. But this idea about the vision that they had in mind, that there was chaos and they had the darkness, when all kinds of bad things are hiding in the dark, and the first thing that God does is create the light when we get to the next one. But what he's doing is trying to begin a story of the Exodus, because the defining moment for the children of Israel is that God liberated them from slavery. And they really came in a powerful way as a people. And then what happened as they told their story, they had to go back. First, well, how did we get down to Egypt and get enslaved? Why were we there in the first place? And then, well, who were our people before then? And then, well, how did it all start? And then, well, where did people come from? And why is our God different than those other people's gods? And so, in saying this, what I'm getting at is the Genesis and the creation story are not told as a statement of faith in itself. It is the introduction to what's coming later. And in that sense, we see that the main idea that the act of creation, the way it's told, is really an act of salvation. Ever heard that before? Did Muzan go over that ever? Don't remember? It's an act of salvation because God is saving humanity from the chaos, from the emptiness, from the formlessness, from the void. And in one of the versions it said, and the earth was a wasteland. It was unproductive. It could not sustain life. And so in the act of creation is really an act of saving grace. God begins that act of saving process with the creation, but in the ancient mind, the raw material was already there. God started exercising God's power in creating, in the making. The word bara, it went away. Oh, there it is. Okay. When I checked this stuff out before, it was stuck on the back. That's the turning the Hebrew little marks into letters. Bara is the word that several of these different scholars point out is the word for make or create and so forth. And usually the subject of that verb is reserved for God. It's not used for tool makers and tent makers and those other kind of makers. So it's made from God. But these main ideas right here at the very first is the formlessness, the void, the wasteland, the emptiness, and then darkness, and over the deeps. The deeps is a reference to the waters, the oceans, and those are seen as dangerous. I mean, these Hebrew people are land dwellers, and if they ever get close to oceans, and they know that those are powerful things with the storms, and sometimes they would see a whale, and oh my gosh, if the only animals you've dealt with are sheep and goats, and the biggest one you've had is a camel, you see a whale out there, oh my goodness, Leviathan, sea monster, it's huge, and it lives out there. That's where it lives. That's not a safe place to go. And so in their minds it has a very terrifying sense and feel. So the deeps is this chaotic thing. Now the next thing that the scholars wrestle with is this mighty wind, and the word of you've heard the ruah, wind, breath, spirit that we talk about, and in the Hebrew language they had very few words, and so much of the meaning of a word is the context and how you used it, which would help you understand, but it wasn't precise like Greek language, which became the language of our medical profession and so forth, where everything is very precise. And so you come up, if you don't have a name for it, you make a new name so that you know what you're naming is this particular thing and not a general name that's real confusing. But in the Hebrew language, it's very poetic. then it works better not to have precision in your language. And but anyway, so it's that word that could be spirit, but it can also mean wind, and then it can also mean breath. So what does it mean here? And as they try to look at it, on the one hand, wind, breath, and spirit all connote power. Breath is the power of life. It's a life-giving source of our oxygen and all. So it power is connected to it. Spirit is, God's Spirit that's enabled to do things, and wind is a force in nature. So the sense of power and the divineness that's attached, it may simply mean that this is a powerful thing. Let's see, there's one of the commentators used the idea of, somebody has talked about something as old. Something is old. You ever heard the expression, as old as God? Meaning it's very old. Now, if something is powerful, and this is one of the things we find in with Pharaoh and Caesar claiming divinity, they had the power to rule. They had ultimate power in their world like God. And so that equating God with divinity is an easy jump. So it's in saying that this wind is so powerful, one of the ways to say that it is superhuman. It is so powerful, it's frightening and destructive. So that may be all that was meant there, that it was truly powerful. And so it takes something more powerful to bring it into control. And so how does God overpower this chaos? Well, God said. God commands. God speaks and God commands. And when God begins to command, then God is taking control. Now that's one interpretation, that the power, the divine-like power, not truly God's power, but a divine-like power, meaning superhuman power, was stirring in this chaos before God began to bring it under control. The other connections, and why a lot of folks have gone with that connection with the Ruach, with wind, breath, spirit, in that it must refer to God is hovering. The Spirit of God is hovering over the deep, getting ready to take it under control. But it's Bruce Vaughter. Where is that? Oh, it's way on the bottom. And I wore out the cover. But Bruce Vaughter's book on Genesis, A New Reading, is the one that goes this way in speaking of that. And then Von Rad, one of the great biblical scholars, and his talked about several of them talked about the saving aspect of creation. This is saving us from the chaos. But that that he thinks that the idea of the wind meaning a gentle hovering breath is a misinterpretation of what the original priestly writer meant, that really saw that it was a powerful stirring of the chaos, and that God begins to bring it under control when God begins to talk and command. There is another aspect that is a part of this, and that is that nearly all creation cosmologies of all the different religions, one of the main things that they're trying to do is deal with the question of evil, the bad stuff. Where did it come from? Now, pagan religion with lots of gods, they have it easy. Anybody want to guess why it's easy for them? Yeah. All the bad stuff, you just blame it on that God. And then we don't like that God that makes the bad stuff happen. We'll offer our sacrifices to the good God that blesses us. But when you have one God, and you're dealing with the source of evil, if this one God, creatio ex nihilo, everything out of nothing, and now you have evil, well, where did that come from? Well, God must have made it. So why did God make it? Why would a loving mother and father bring a rapist into their daughter's bedroom and say, "Here you go"? How can you love someone who brings evil and violence onto the people they love? Creates a big problem. For the Hebrew folks, with this concept that the evil in the world is really that chaos, that wasteland, that formless void, and their God brought it under control. Began to take charge. And so they didn't have the Greek analytical minds, well, where did God come from? Where did the material come from? Who made that stuff? I mean, they weren't asking that question at that time. We had to get smart and start asking that question, and made us all confused. But for them, that was a way of their way of dealing with the question of the evil and keeping their God, our Elohim, Yahweh, off the hook. The evil was already there. Now, when the evil comes back, God isn't doing it. It's these foreign powers. And in the story of the great flood and Noah, it's everybody was bad. People wouldn't follow God's direction, and everything just went bad. And so the evil took over, and we had the chaos of the storm and the flood and all of that. The chaos broke loose again. And in God's saving act, He brings it back under control again and starts over and comes out with another idea. I'll choose a person, I'll choose a people, and I'll let them lead the rest of humanity. But anyway, let's see. I think that's enough for today. Any questions with the last few minutes we've got? Yes, sir. Well, I could send you to Cokesbury store, but they closed. I don't know if Mardell, because Barnes & Noble probably does. They should. And they could order it for you. Yeah, Barnes & Noble. Or you could check with us here. We can order Yeah, we can. Yeah, you can do Cokesbury online, and do that. That one's good. But anyway, yes, sir.
Would you care to comment on the book, A History of God?
The History of God.
A History of God.
I haven't read it,
Okay.
so I can't, with any integrity or intelligence or.
I've already read in chapter 1.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's so many books. I've got one that's kind of like that. It says God has a story, and it's by an Old Testament scholar. Okay, well, how do we? Did you count us? Okay, good. All righty. Well, I'll let you all go get a drink or go to water or coffee or something, and I'll be back next week. I'm going to be gone for a week on vacation, but I'll be back here next Sunday to be with you, and we will move on as we have God speaking and taking control and shaping the rest of everything. Yes, sir.
I do have a question. I don't know if you might